right, sir, here we are.
John, good to be here. Thanks.
So throughout the day today, we've already had a lot of conversation. I mean, we've heard talk about AI, we've heard talk about policies and ways to sort of change our procurement cycle. I want to just open up the floor at the start here and ask you, what does that look like and at sort of that bleeding edge for the service member and for the warfighter?
Yeah, I think, so for those who aren't familiar, perhaps, U.S. Army Western Hemisphere Command, about 90 days old. We are born of the Army's priority on continuous transformation. That's one of our chief's focus areas. And so the command's 90 plus days old, give or take. And we're starting to get our arms around really the breadth and depth of the problems that we face in this hemisphere on behalf of the administration's priority and the national security strategy, national defense strategy that prioritize the Western Hemisphere alongside the threats that we face in the other theaters globally. So by saying that, I just want to emphasize that the technological problems that exist in our European theater of operations, in our Central Command theater of operations, in our Indo-Pacific theater of operations, they exist here at scale in the Western Hemisphere, and yet they're a little bit immature. And therefore, you could argue we have a ways to go in terms of developing the tech to meet our needs, in particular in what I would argue is the Southcom area of operations, the Southern Hemisphere, maybe not so much in the Northcom AOR, in the CONUS in Mexico and Canada, because we have been operating there. But we have a platform, for example, in Northcom along the southern border that has great capacity and has been very rapidly adapting technology for its use on the border to perform the mission that the administration has given it. But I take a look at it a little bit differently. First off, having a command like mine that bridges that seam between the Northcom and Southcom AOR opens up the aperture to apply the technological capabilities and advancements that we're making and we're using in the Northcom AOR in the South much more rapidly. And I think we saw some of that in recent operations right after the turn of the new year. And I think you're going to see more of that with some of the agreements that we're making with countries in the Western Hemisphere or in the South America and Central America, either bilaterally or through the Counter Cartel Coalition, the Shield of the Americas, just recently unveiled, as a matter of fact, this past weekend. I also think there's great opportunities to leverage emerging technology faster in an environment where we haven't learned bad habits. I'll just, I know my partners in Europe and the Indo-Pacific as an example. In Europe especially, a very mature, very well-established sustainment architecture in Europe. In some ways, that gives them great advantage to apply new tech to the problem as long as they use it and they fight through the, hey, we're going to do it the way we've always done it mentality. Sure. I, on the other hand, have little to no architecture to break that has formed bad habits, and I can, I think, leverage the technology and make exponential gains a little more rapidly. And there's a number of examples of that, and we can talk about some of that.
Well, I do. You opened the door there a little bit. You mentioned the operation earlier this year in Venezuela.
Yep.
From all reports, a huge part of that was the intelligence side of the community. And obviously, without getting into anything that we can't talk about in a public setting.
Sure.
The opportunity that sort of artificial intelligence and current data collection presents is basically, hey, here's a flood, but what does it look like for you and for the warfighter actually trying to find signal through the noise, if that makes sense? Trying to pluck out the things that are actually useful versus just having all of this information at your fingertips, but chasing after rabbits.
Yeah, well, you've got to have a seamless data architecture where you can leverage the inputs that are, that are most relevant to the mission at hand, the task at hand, and be able to sift through them rapidly to to provide decision advantage for commanders and decision makers at echelon. And that's no different anywhere else than it is in any other theater of operations. And yet, again, in an immature theater, when you have to build it from scratch, you find that there are efficiencies to be gained very rapidly. And I'll paint one picture for you that I think is illustrative. We have a task force, a joint interagency task force, JIATF South in Key West, that's been looking at trafficking routes, counter narcotics environment in the Caribbean, especially for years, and they have been doing a fantastic job. And without getting into, again, specifics about how they have been doing that, they've been doing whatever they could with whatever they could in terms of the resources available and the technology available. Applying new capabilities to that headquarters, our 18th Airborne Corps that has been doing a number of forays into technological development through their Scarlet Dragon program that many of you may be familiar with or may have heard about. We established a joint innovation outpost at Fort Bragg recently that's going to leverage some of the other technological advancement ideas and networking ideas that the command has that they know will make them a more capable Corps headquarters expeditionary across the globe. A visit from 18th Airborne Corps to JIATF South to talk to them about how they're doing it and what they're doing was instrumental to some of their ability to leap forward and not make iterative gains, but exponential gains. But I think the basic premise across all theaters is essentially the same. How do we, as you described, John, how do we sift through the massive information, the massive data that we had, cull it down to those things, those inputs that are relevant to the problem at hand, whether that's an operational problem, a targeting problem, a sustainment problem, an intelligence collection problem, whatever it is, distill it to the inputs that are relevant, and then present it in a way to the commander where he can make quick decisions. That's decision advantage. And that process applies across all theaters, and that's something that we have proven in a short period of time we can scale in a relatively immature theater like the Southern Command AOR.
Well, and y'all also have a unique sort of challenge in the interoperability aspect of that. I would imagine that plays a lot into some of the decisions that you're talking about in terms of how you build the structure, how you actually create some of the visibility for different partners.
Absolutely.
When you think about that problem set, what are some of like the big wins that you've seen so far in trying to build that structure? But then also, what are some pitfalls that you feel like you've been able to avoid?
Well, you're exactly right in that every single mission we're performing in the Western Hemisphere has an interagency, intergovernmental component to it. Whether it's a U.S. only mission or it's a bilateral or multilateral mission with other nations, other partners across the hemisphere. But I'll give you one example that I think speaks to that. Our tightest interagency partnership right now, perhaps arguably, is with Customs and Border Protection on the southern border. 101st Airborne Division has been on the border now for about 5 months-ish, give or take. Took over from the 10th Mountain Division. The CG, 10th Mountain Division, Scott Nauman did a great job of establishing the command and bringing it to a point where Dave Gardner, the CG at the 101st, could really take it and move out with it by applying several other technological solutions to his network that has made him better. And one of the areas where they've definitely gotten better is in an awareness across the land domain that's shared between the military on the border and Customs and Border Protection on the border, and all of the Department of Homeland Security assets that inform that 1,954-mile border. What we found, and this was a little bit unique to us as a military organization, because in the Army, we decentralize command and control until it hurts, as you know,
Absolutely.
right, John? And we expect our commanders at echelon to perform mission command, where they take intent and they take purpose, and then they apply that intent and purpose to the task at hand, and they accomplish the task, within the intent of the higher commander.
Weight of the world on a 24-year-old shoulders.
Well, that's right. But again, that's the training and that's the expectation that we give those folks. And of course, there's inputs to higher commanders, whether they're automatic inputs through data, or they're verbal inputs through keying a hand mic to inform the higher commander of status. Right. The former is always preferred over the latter. And so what we want to do is get those automatic inputs so it's on a dashboard, it's presented to us in one place where we can see it, and again, we can get decision advantage, and we can see problems before perhaps the 24-year-old at the tip of the spear even knows that they're coming.
Sure.
The linkage we've been able to form with Customs and Border Protection, just as simple as bringing their position location information, their PLI, into our common operating picture. Made a huge difference in terms of our ability to perform the mission we're performing on the border. Outside of as most of you have probably read or know, we've established national defense areas on the border. Those have been purposeful to give the military forces on the border because they're technically military property. They're property of the various services linked to installations along the border. So that's given military forces authority in that space that we didn't have before. Not arrest authority per se, but at least detention authority. But those NDAs make up a very small percentage of the border writ large, and the people, the agency with arrest authority on the border, the large majority of it remains Customs and Border Protection. So a U.S. military organization, a patrol or an outpost can observe, they can see something, they can use their associated sensors to pick up something, movement or suspicious activity, but all they can do is monitor it unless they can get Customs and Border Protection vectored in. Having something simple as their PLI feed into our common operating picture, and then being able to use that data to make quick decisions to get the closest CBP element to the point where they need to be to interdict that activity and determine whether it's illicit or not. Absolutely critical to being fast.
I want to take it down to the soldier level a little bit.
Sure.
You've been talking about the network and about common operating picture, providing a lot of this intelligence. We mentioned like a company commander, this 24-year-old.
Yep.
Right now, one of your former units, 25th, is actually going through a testing cycle with the next generation command and control system.
Right. That's right.
It sounds like with this interoperability with sort of other partners, more like law enforcement partners, you're basically working against the friction of that same problem set. But I know from time spent out in Colorado with 4th Infantry Division, the cannon crew chief used to put it all down on paper and send up that report. And now they've got him sort of inputting that same report on an iPad. And the moment that glass breaks, he's going to toss it in the back of the truck.
Sure.
How do we overcome that friction gap for the soldier of actually making this data architecture that everyone keeps talking about realistic, usable?
Yeah. So it's a great question, and it's not one that's lost on anybody who's spent a day in the Army. And from an artilleryman or a former artilleryman, I would expect no other type of question from a guy like you. So we'll leave that there for a second. But let me say this. So Pat Ellis at 4th Infantry Division, who I know you've met and talked to in the Ivy Sting series and the work he's doing with Next Gen C2. Jay Bartholomew's out at 25th, also working a separate and somewhat distinct and yet parallel effort with Next Gen C2 and the 25th Infantry Division. They both are there are a ton of parallels there, but like any good experiment, there's controls to each, and we want them each to be slightly different so that they tell us different things. In Pat's case, Pat served in U.S. Army Europe, and then did a year as our network CFT director, and now he's out there at 4th. And so he's been given an education, if you will, which started well before he was in Europe, but certainly was refined in Europe, given the coalition environment there, the NATO environment there, that he was able to work within to streamline some of the network and data architecture, and now bringing it to 4th Infantry Division, where it's largely an Army experiment, but those lessons that Pat has in his head about how this is really going to work at the edge isn't lost on him. Jay, out in the Indo-Pacific, and I know from my previous time having commanded out there in the 25th, everything's bilateral with partners and allies.
Right.
It's not lost on anybody that there's no NATO in the Indo-Pacific, so everything's bilateral. Those bilateral relationships are very important, but it's very difficult when you try to bring folks together to the same type of problem. And that's a lot of what Jay has to think about as he's developing his network there. But I'm confident that Pat has his in a little bit of a vacuum there at Fort Carson, but still has that very much front of mind. To get to your point about what we do when the inputs at the tip of the spear break down, we have got to, a PACE plan is not a theoretical element, right?
It's primary, alternate, contingent.
Contingency and emergency, right?
That's right.
And sometimes, you don't ever want to go to the emergency, but when you have to, you have to. But you got to have the PACE plan. We can't be one-trick ponies or we'll fail. Because one of the whole reason we developed a PACE plan because we know one of those is going to fail. And we know, despite what we do for the network, any element of it, the data layer, the transport layer, right, the application layer, something is prone to fail at some point in time. We have to use good common sense and develop a PACE plan where we've got something to fall back on, so that your proverbial gun bunny down there inputting data into an iPad has a backup, and then knows what the backup is. And then it's our job in a unit, and it's on the backs of squad leaders and platoon sergeants and company commanders to ensure that those contingencies are rehearsed and refined and rehearsed, so that they know what to do in the event of a crisis. I mean, any of you who've listened to the secretary and the chairman talk the last few times they've been on the news talking about what they've watched and witnessed with the joint force performing in the Iran conflict today. I mean, the chairman's been unequivocal in his praise, and yet we all know that those service members, regardless of service, they are out there fighting through friction every single minute of the day. And so that's where the American warrior gets his bona fides. That's where we've established them over 2+ decades of war. But it's also just an element of warfare, the friction, the fog of war that's been aptly described across history, and we can't forget it. And so the technological inputs are always going to make us faster when they work. We've always got to be prepared for the inevitable breakdown and be able to revert to contingency work.
And I mean, part of what I'm hearing you say, and I think the chairman very much hammered this home, all of this data, all of this sort of predictive analysis for logistics, very important. For all of our different operations, at the end of the day, it comes down to a U.S. service member who is either having to input it, figure out what the next step is if that system's broken, or if that system's, you go to the next, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
When we think of that, it comes across to me that it's a point to hammer home, because when we talk about all of this massive data architecture, it still has to have those inputs.
Sure.
I do want to switch gears slightly as we sort of wrap up our last sort of 10 minutes here.
Yeah, if I could just, I want to
Absolutely.
pull that thread for a second, John.
Yes, sir.
So you were up in Alaska recently for the Joint Pacific Multinational
You
Readiness
caught me.
Center. You were with 10th Group, the 11th Airborne Division, with U.S. Army Pacific, in the Arctic, -30, -40, austere conditions. What we find in those austere conditions, of course, is that any templated, loiter time, station time for a drone, cut in half, cut in 2/3. Battery life,
down to 20%.
At best. So this is an example where, just a perfect example where while we can sort of wish away the problem of fighting in the Arctic, that's a problem for others. That's not a problem for guys like me, right? And the challenges that you look at in employing some of those same systems where you may have plenty of battery life in, say, a humid jungle environment in South America or in the Indo-Pacific, but range and line of sight and other obstacles are going to impede your ability to do the work. Satellite shots are obscured by some level of canopy of jungle, et cetera, et cetera. There's always friction to fight through. I don't want to take away at all the value of the tech because, again, what the technology is doing in our formations today, and we've talked a lot about the impact of the network specific work that we're doing in the Army. What those are doing is they're opening up the possibility of what we can achieve, when we were able to set conditions and make sure that the environment is conducive to our operations. And we, for a few years there, we went through a period of time in the Army where we called those a particular thing. We called them a convergence window, where we knew we had everything sort of aligned and we could get things done, but we knew it was going to be a short period of time before the adversary came back and was able to do something else to disrupt our momentum. And this isn't a near-peer fight, and this is against an adversary that has, on par capabilities to us. That's not necessarily a challenge that I have directly in the Western Hemisphere, right? We talked about that a little bit backstage. Our environment's a little bit different. We have an adversary in this hemisphere, and it's the People's Republic of China, but they're going about their business a little bit indirectly here in this hemisphere, and we've got to address some of those things. But the illicit activity of the cartel networks and others, I wouldn't exactly term them peer adversaries. And yet, in many cases in my hemisphere, the environment is where we run into friction with the technology. And therefore, either way, you got to fight through it. And drilling it and teaching it in places like JPMRC in the Arctic, in places like the National Training Center and the Joint Readiness Training Center, where from the Army's perspective, I know the Army is trying to outfit those opposing force units and the environments there at our ultimate training centers with the capability to disrupt the training units' momentum and pace and tempo, because that's what we believe the reality is going to be on the battlefield. And so again, it's just another way to provide them with an iterative way to work through friction in training, because regardless of what we do, that's never going to go away.
Well, and part of what I'm hearing you say, especially for this audience, is don't plan to have your product just exist in perfect lab conditions. Try to plan and develop something that's going to be able to meet some friction, have warfighters actually mess with it and try to overcome those obstacles.
So you just described continuous transformation, transform, and contact, right? And I know, if you've read about the Army, you know about the Army, and you know what our chief, General George, is doing. That's his primary focus is iterating in operational units in real conditions with emerging technology, and then determining how the emerging technology, as it modifies and changes and adapts the way a unit can fight. Then we look at organizational changes we can take advantage of to modify organizations to make them more lethal. The Mobile Brigade Combat Team in the Army was a perfect example of how we did that. We took a number of emerging technological ideas and advancements, and we gave them to an operational unit, and we said, here's an idea of what structure we think you might be able to fight with on paper. Take it to JRTC. And then we did it, and we're doing it at the National Training Center. And then we did it at the Joint Pacific Multinational Readiness Center out in the Pacific with the 25th Infantry Division. So I would say what it means to our vendors and our professionals out in the crowd is get your thing, whether it's a tangible thing or it's a software solution, hardware solution, piece of kit, get it into the Army's transform in contact loop. The Army is just providing a open platform for commercial vendors to come in and practice with us, to learn more about your piece of equipment, your technological solution, to test it against what we believe are real or near real conditions in a real unit, and then provide you direct feedback so that you can take it and improve it. And it's that iterative loop that will make us all better. We're going to learn from you, and the intent is you're going to learn from us. The other organization that we've created in one particular facet of that, the JIATA 401, which is led by Brigadier General Matt Ross, and I use him in a number of examples when I go to talk like this.
The counter small
UAS,
yes.
Yeah, counter small UAS. So Matt is moving very quickly to, from an institutional perspective, and with the authority of the Deputy Secretary of Defense, and with an ability to provide funding for those efforts that do work, he's moving very quickly to provide a platform where vendors can come in, test their equipment in real conditions for all the services, not just for the Army. I mean, Matt's an Army guy, but he's taken on a joint role. He's the right guy to do it. He's an operator. He's a former infantryman. He's not a UAS or air defender by trade, but he knows what operators' needs are. And so he's provided a platform where you can do that type of thing iteratively too. And I'm hopeful that across all the services, folks are learning from that model. It's certainly one in the Army that's paying dividends for us.
Sir, I want to try to come full circle here. So a lot of what's been talked about today, and what you were just talking about there, talking about changes in policy, changes to the way that we maneuver funding, not just internal to the Army or even the department, but also just Congress is approaching this differently.
Sure.
The transformation in contact, these are all very effective, but they are also very new. How does leadership within the services maintain this kind of momentum
Sure.
to actually stay on top of new technology rather than just hit the next administration regardless of party and backslide? I mean, I remember growing up with a lot of different programs that promised to be what essentially a lot of the promises are now.
Yeah. Well, I know Undersecretary Obadal came in earlier today, and I saw his notes. I didn't get a chance to see his session, but between Secretary Driscoll, General George, Undersecretary Obadal, and now Vice Chris Leneve, they are very aware of and very cognizant of the requirement to get over to Congress and keep folks in the loop as to what we're doing. They've also chartered guys like me, Dave Hodney in our Transformation Training Command, Chris Mohan at Army Materiel Command, just to name a few. CD when he's back from U.S. Army Europe, and Ron Clark in the Pacific when he's back, to get over to the Hill, to talk about what we're doing, to talk about the effects that it's having, and to talk about the importance of the approach. We're not making converts overnight, because we've got healthy skepticism over on the Hill, and I appreciate their position, and we want to. It's our responsibility to continue to engage, as you know. But I believe we are making headway, and I think hopefully Undersecretary Obadal did talk about some of that this morning in some particular areas. The command and control network effort that we're doing out in Colorado and in Hawaii is just one example where it's gotten a ton of attention. I mean, you went out to Ivy Sting that Pat's been hosting. A number of other folks went out to Ivy Sting. We could probably get a show of hands here of folks who've at least heard about and want to get out to Ivy Sting if they haven't gone themselves, because that venue, that platform, is intended to provide a state of play. It's not a. We sort of used to have these. VIP days where we'd bring everybody out, dog and pony show, everything worked, everything looked great, we had a narrative. I'm criticizing my own service here for doing some of those things in the past. That is not what's happening today, and our chief forbids it from happening. And you've heard our secretary very publicly talk about things like right to repair. You've heard our chief talk about things like budget line item consolidation and agile funding. These are all efforts that we got to continue to communicate over on the Hill so that we gain as much flexibility as we can to do the work that we need to do. Because if I can leave the audience with anything here, and I hope the way I've communicated some of this leaves no doubt that we are in an era of rapid technological change. We are in an era of rapid change in the character warfare, and the idea that the Army or any of our units would not transform is simply not something that's on the table anymore. This is not something we're choosing to do. This is something we have to do just to stay relevant. And we've made a ton of progress, and yet, I sit here after about 2.5 years in the building and now 90 days in my new command at Fort Bragg, and we still see that we've got miles to go. And so gathering people like this here to have a discussion like this and to listen hopefully imbues you all with a sense of purpose and energy, that we are open to ideas, open to new tech. We've got platforms that are able to test it, and we'll give you great feedback. And because we want you to succeed, we want to use your tech to help us get better too.
Well, sir, from the audience here and the Washington Times, thanks very much.
Thanks,
appreciate
John.
it.
I appreciate it.